The invitation was a slap in the face. Attending was an act of pure masochism. Faye sat in the back row, picking at a loose thread on her clearance rack dress, suffocating in the cloying scent of funeral lilies. Then a stranger leaned in, smelling of cedar. Pretend I'm him. Table 14 had a wobble. It sat in the direct flight path of the kitchen swinging doors, meaning every 90 seconds, Faye was hit by a gust of air smelling fiercely of scorched prime rib, stale sweat, and institutional dish soap. She dragged a blunt, unpolished fingernail across the cheap polyester tablecloth, listening to the abrasive zip-zip sound it made. It was the only thing grounding her. Across the cavernous country club ballroom, David was laughing. It was that thick, booming laugh, the one that used to make Faye feel like she was standing inside a fortress, safe from the world. Now, hearing it echo off the crystal chandeliers, it sounded like a threat. He had his hand resting on the small of Chloe's back. Chloe, who was 24, unburdened by stretch marks or crushing daycare debts, and wearing a silk gown that probably cost more than Faye's annual rent. Faye took a sip of her white wine. It was warm and tasted like pennies and bruised apples. She swallowed it down, ignoring the sour burn in her throat. She shouldn't be here. She knew that. David knew that. But he had played the card he always played, the modern, evolved co-parenting card. It would mean a lot to Leo if his mom was there to support our new family, he had said, standing on her crumbling front porch 2 weeks ago, smelling of expensive cologne and victory. Leo was 4. He didn't care about modern family dynamics. He cared about Paw Patrol and apple juice. But David knew Faye's weakness. She was terrified of looking bitter, terrified of being the angry ex-wife stereotype. So she bought a navy blue dress on clearance at a department store, shoved her swollen feet into 5-year-old pumps, and showed up to watch her replacement get crowned. The seat to her right was empty. The placard read, Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis had clearly possessed the good sense to fake a stomach bug. Faye rubbed the back of her neck. The sheer pantyhose she was wearing dug a vicious, itchy trench into her waist. She closed her eyes, letting the thumping, generic bass of the wedding band rattle her teeth, calculating how many minutes she had to stay before she could slip out to the valet, drive home, and pay the babysitter she couldn't afford. A heavy thud made her eyes snap open. A glass of amber liquid landed on the table, instantly leaving a condensation ring on the polyester. A man pulled out the chair belonging to the phantom Mr. Davis and sat down heavily. He didn't look like he belonged at a country club wedding. He was wearing a dark wool suit, impeccably tailored, but he wore it like a cage. The tie was already undone, hanging loose around a collar that had been unbuttoned. He smelled of cold night air, sharp cedar, and expensive scotch. Faye stared at him. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the bride and groom at the head table. His jaw flexed. There was a faint purple bruise blooming over his right cheekbone, subtle but undeniably violent. "You're not Arthur Davis," Faye said, her voice raspy from disuse. She hadn't spoken to a single soul since handing her coat to the attendant. The man slowly turned his head. His eyes were dark, bloodshot, and exhausted. They scanned her, taking in the stiff posture, the defensive crossing of her arms, the navy dress that screamed maternal obligation. "No," he said. His voice was gravelly, scraping against the loud music. "Arthur had a sudden, unavoidable conflict involving a bottle of gin and a locked bathroom. I'm taking his shift." He took a slow drag from his glass. Faye watched his throat work. There was a heavy, suffocating gravity to him. He didn't fidget. He didn't try to make polite small talk. He just sat there, projecting a dense field of hostility toward the front of the room. "Friend of the groom?" Fay asked, instantly regretting it. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to sink into the floorboards. "Business associate," he corrected, swirling the ice in his glass. "Unfortunately, in our tax bracket, the two are tragically confused. And you?" Fay looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were raw from scrubbing the bathtub that morning. "I'm the ghost of Christmas past." The man stopped swirling his drink. He looked at her properly this time, his gaze dropping to her unadorned ring finger, then flicking over to the head table where David was currently feeding a strawberry to his new bride. A short, breathless bark of laughter escaped him. It lacked any real humor. "You're the ex-wife," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Gold star for the detective," Fay muttered, picking up her warm metallic wine. "I'm here to prove how well-adjusted I am, how entirely unbothered I am by the fact that he traded me in for a model with fewer miles and zero emotional baggage." She didn't know why she was saying this. She had spent 3 hours practicing her stoic, agreeable smile in the bathroom mirror. But the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her lungs, and this stranger with the bruised face didn't feel like a person she needed to lie to. He felt like a fellow inmate. "Is it working?" he asked, taking another sip. "I'm at table 14, Fay said, gesturing vaguely to the swinging kitchen doors, just as a waiter blew past carrying a tray of dirty plates. The smell of congealed gravy washed over them. "Next to the garbage disposal and the spare linens. I think that answers your question." The man's mouth twitched, a ghost of a smirk. "I'm Grant," he said. "Fay." Before Grant could say anything else, a shadow fell over the table. Fay looked up and felt her stomach drop into her shoes. It was Helen, David's mother. The woman was draped in metallic silver organza, looking like a heavily jeweled baked potato. Her eyes were sharp and glittering with predatory pity. "Fay, darling," Helen cooed, her voice carrying over the music. She rested a manicured, heavy hand on Fay's shoulder. The rings bit through the fabric of Fay's dress. "I was so worried you wouldn't come. Sitting all the way back here, all by yourself. It's so brave of you. Really. Everyone is saying how brave you are." The word brave hung in the air, toxic and patronizing. It meant pathetic. It meant tragic. Fay felt the heat rushing up her neck, a humiliating flush of red that she couldn't stop. She opened her mouth, but her throat tightened. She was going to cry. Right here, next to the kitchen doors, under the terrifying gaze of her ex-mother-in-law. It was the absolute worst-case scenario. Helen leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a theatrical whisper. "If it's too much, dear, no one would judge you if you slipped out. It's a lot to process, seeing David so fulfilled." Fay's vision blurred. Her fingernails dug so hard into her palms they threatened to break the skin. Then, a sudden heavy warmth pressed against her side. Grant shifted in his chair, closing the gap between them. He didn't just lean in. He draped his arm casually, territorially, over the back of Fay's chair. His fingers brushed the bare skin of her shoulder, calloused, warm, startlingly solid. "She's not by herself, Helen," Grant said smoothly. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a dark, silken authority. "And we aren't slipping out anywhere. The night is just getting started." Helen's heavily mascaraed eyes snapped toward Grant. The condescending pity in her expression fractured, replaced instantly by the calculating assessment of a woman who recognized power when it spoke. She took in the cut of his wool lapel, the gold of his watch peeking from beneath his cuff, the quiet, undeniable arrogance in his posture. "Oh," Helen stuttered, her hand dropping from Faye's shoulder as if the navy fabric had caught fire. I didn't realize. David didn't mention Faye was bringing a guest. Grant's fingers curled slightly against Faye's shoulder. The touch was electric, not because of any sudden romantic spark, but because it was the first time in 3 years someone had touched her to defend her. Faye was rigid, her breath trapped shallowly in her chest. She smelled the scotch on his breath, the faint metallic tang of sweat mixed with whatever expensive soap he used. David doesn't know everything, Grant said, his tone perfectly polite, perfectly lethal. He looked at Faye, his expression softening into something so convincingly intimate it made Faye's stomach clench. "Isn't that right, darling?" The pet name felt like a heavy coat thrown over her shivering shoulders. Faye forced her jaw to unlock. She swallowed the lump of humiliation lodged in her throat. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's right." Helen offered a tight plastic smile, mumbling an excuse about needing to check on the floral centerpieces, before practically fleeing back toward the safe, manicured territory of the front tables. As soon as she was out of earshot, Faye exhaled a shaky breath, slumping forward. She expected Grant to pull his arm away, to laugh off the charity he'd just thrown her. Instead, his hand slid from the back of her chair to rest flat against her spine. The heat of his palm bled through the thin fabric of her clearance rack dress. "Don't deflate," he murmured, his voice dropping low, strictly for her ears. "If you slump now, she wins. Sit up." Faye bristled. The instinct to rebel against a command flared up, masking her embarrassment. "I didn't ask for your help." "No," Grant agreed, picking up his glass with his free hand. He didn't move the hand on her back. "You were just going to sit there and let her dissect you like a frog in a high school biology class." "I was handling it." "You were crying into a warm glass of Chardonnay." Faye glared at him. Up close, the bruise on his cheekbone looked tender, the edges yellowing slightly. His eyes held no pity, only a flat, pragmatic exhaustion. "Why do you care?" she snapped, the cynicism bubbling over. "You don't know me. I'm just the pathetic ex-wife at table 14. Grant turned his head. Their faces were inches apart. The ambient noise of the wedding, the clinking glasses, the terrible saxophone solo, the laughter, seemed to dial down. "Because I am sitting at table 14, too," he said quietly, "and I have my own ghost to fend off tonight." He nodded vaguely toward the other side of the room. Faye followed his gaze. A group of older men in tuxedos were standing by the bar, watching Grant with predatory, hawkish intensity. Beside them, a stunning woman in a backless red dress was staring holes into the back of Grant's head. "Business associates?" Faye asked dryly. "Sharks," Grant corrected, "and an ex-fiancée who thinks my recent hostile takeover of her father's firm is an invitation to renegotiate our relationship." Faye looked back at him, the pieces clicking together. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a man using a shield, and he had just realized she was holding one too. "Oh, so," Grant continued, leaning in just a fraction closer. His breath brushed her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her neck. "Here is the proposition, Faye. You need to look utterly unbothered, spectacularly moved on and entirely out of David's league. I need to look completely unavailable to a room full of vultures." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over them. "Pretend I'm your husband tonight." Faye stared at him. The absurdity of it tasted metallic on her tongue. "My husband. Or lover, partner. Whatever label makes you walk with a straight spine." Grant finally removed his hand from her back and stood up. He extended a hand toward her. "Let's get away from the kitchen doors. We need a drink. A real one. Faye looked at his outstretched hand. It was large, the knuckles rough, a stark contrast to David's soft, manicured fingers. Logic screamed at her to stay seated. She had a toddler at home who had cried when she left because his ear hurt. She had $94 in her checking account until Thursday. She did not belong in this game of corporate sharks and high society revenge. But then she looked across the room. David was watching her. He was standing with his groomsmen, a slight patronizing frown creasing his forehead as he observed Faye interacting with a man he didn't recognize. Spite, Faye realized in that moment, was a remarkably powerful fuel. She placed her hand in Grant's. His grip was firm, pulling her up with effortless strength. The sudden shift in elevation made her dizzy. Or maybe it was the way he immediately tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, pulling her firmly against his side. The physical proximity was jarring. Faye walked stiffly, hyper-aware of the friction of her hip against his, the heavy drape of his wool jacket, the subtle shift of muscle underneath. She felt rusty, obsolete. She couldn't remember the last time she had leaned against a man without worrying if she was taking up too much space. "Relax," Grant murmured as they wove through the crowded tables toward the main bar. "You're walking like you're heading to the guillotine." "I feel like I'm walking into a buzzsaw," she hissed through a forced, pleasant smile. "I don't know how to do this. I'm a pediatric nurse. I do juice boxes and triage, not whatever this is." "Just breathe," he said, adjusting his stride to match hers. "And look at me. Don't look at him." They reached the mahogany bar. The bartender, sensing the shift in gravity Grant brought with him, immediately abandoned a frantic bridesmaid to approach them. "Mr. Hayes, the usual?" Grant nodded. "And a French 75 for my wife. Make it with the good gin, not the well trash." Faye's chest tightened at the casual slip of the word wife. It fell from his lips so easily, stripped of the heavy, suffocating expectations David had always attached to it. Before the drinks could arrive, the crowd parted. Faye didn't need to look to know who was approaching. She could feel the temperature drop. "Faye!" David's voice cut through the background noise, thick with false joviality and a sharp undercurrent of territorial confusion. "I didn't expect to see you at the bar. Usually you hate crowds." Faye turned. David stood there a foot away, smelling of the cologne she had bought him 3 Christmases ago. Chloe was nowhere in sight. David's eyes darted from Faye's flushed face to Grant, lingering on the way Grant's arm had slipped around Faye's waist, pulling her flush against him. "You people change, David," Grant answered before Faye could speak. His voice was smooth, a dangerous purr that rattled the glasses on the bar. Faye just needed better company. David's jaw worked, a hard rhythmic clench that Faye knew intimately. It was the tell he deployed right before an argument about credit card bills or his mother's boundaries. But David didn't look at Grant. Instead, he directed a look of profound, weaponized disappointment entirely at Faye. "A French 75? David asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You get heartburn from cheap champagne, Faye, and you're driving." He paused, letting his eyes drag over her clearance rack dress, making sure she felt the weight of his appraisal. "Who is watching Leo? I thought we agreed tonight wasn't about dragging strangers into our mess. It's supposed to be about family." There it was. The guilt trip, precision engineered to hit her squarely in the chest. A year ago, Faye would have folded. She would have stammered an apology, put the drink down, and let him usher her toward the coat check. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the cold, sticky mahogany of the bar to hide the tremor. Grant didn't intervene. He stood perfectly still, his hand resting like a warm iron anchor on her waist. He was waiting. He was giving her the floor. Faye looked at David. She saw the familiar crinkles around his eyes, the slight thinning of his hair that he tried to hide with expensive pomade. He wasn't a fortress anymore. He was just a man in a rented tuxedo, trying to control a woman he no longer loved. "Leo's with Mrs. Gable," Faye said. Her voice cracked on the first syllable, but she cleared her throat and forced the volume up. "He had a double ear infection yesterday, David. Did you know that?" "No, because when I texted you from the urgent care waiting room, you said you were busy with the florist." David flushed, a mottled red creeping up his neck. "That's incredibly unfair, Faye. Today is my wedding." "Today is Thursday," she interrupted, the bluntness of the statement surprising even her. "It's Thursday, and Leo's eardrum nearly ruptured. So don't stand there and play the protective patriarch. It doesn't suit you." The silence that followed was dense enough to choke on. A few guests standing near the bar stopped talking, their heads tilted in transparent eavesdropping. David looked around, hyper-aware of the audience, the carefully constructed facade of his perfect day threatening to crack. "Right," David muttered, his tone turning venomous. He finally looked at Grant. "Well, good luck with her. She's a lot of work." David turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing back into the safety of his curated crowd. Faye stared at the space where he had been standing. Her lungs burned. She felt entirely hollowed out, the adrenaline draining from her bloodstream so fast it left her lightheaded. She swayed slightly on her scuffed pumps. The bartender set a frosted coupe glass in front of her, the lemon twist clinging to the rim. Grant picked it up and pressed the chilled glass into her trembling hand. "Drink it," he ordered gently. Faye brought the rim to her lips. The gin was icy and botanical, biting through the sugar and lemon with clinical precision. It burned all the way down, leaving a trail of clarifying heat in its wake. She took another larger swallow, closing her eyes against the sting. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, staring into the pale yellow liquid. "Now I'm the crazy ex-wife making a scene at the bar." "You didn't make a scene. You stated a medical fact," Grant said, picking up his own glass. "And for the record, he looked like a panicked accountant." "You looked terrifying." "It was a good look." Faye let out a breathy, broken sound that might have been a laugh. She leaned back against the bar, the friction of her shoulder brushing Grant's jacket, feeling less like a shock and more like a tether. "My turn," Grant murmured. Faye didn't have to ask what he meant. The air around them suddenly smelled heavily of bergamot and expensive powder. A woman materialized at Grant's elbow. She was breathtaking in a sterile, terrifying way. Her dark hair was slicked back into a severe knot, and her red silk dress clung to her hips like a second skin. "Grant," the woman said. Her voice was smooth, devoid of any inflection. She didn't even glance at Faye. "I saw you sitting with the rejects at table 14. I assumed you were hiding from my father. Or from me." "Valerie," Grant replied, his tone flattening into a sheet of ice. "I'm not hiding. I'm just acutely selective about my company." Valerie finally turned her gaze to Faye. Her eyes were a pale, icy blue, sweeping over Faye's frizzy hair and unremarkable makeup. The dismissal in her expression was absolute. It was the same look David had given her, just packaged in a higher tax bracket. "Fascinating," Valerie drawled. "Is this a charity project? Or did you just need a prop to prove you have a soul after gutting my family's board of directors this morning?" Faye felt the muscle in Grant's jaw feather beneath his skin. His arm around her waist went rigid. The hostility between them wasn't petty. It was radioactive. Faye looked at the purple bruise blooming on Grant's cheekbone. She thought about the heavy, exhausted way he had sat down at her table. He was a shark, maybe, but right now he was bleeding in the water. Faye shifted her weight, stepping deliberately into Valerie's line of sight. She didn't try to stand taller or suck in her stomach. She just let her clinical, pediatric nurse exhaustion bleed into her voice. "He doesn't need a prop, Valerie," Faye said, her tone utterly bored. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing the lapel of Grant's wool suit, a gesture so deeply domestic it felt profane. He just needed a break from women who talk like bad soap opera villains. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my husband and I are going to get some air." Faye didn't wait for Valerie's reaction. She kept her hand flat against Grant's chest, feeling the heavy, accelerated thud of his heartbeat through his shirt, and pushed off the bar. Grant moved with her instantly, catching her rhythm. They didn't look back as they navigated the maze of round tables and drunken dancers, heading straight for the heavy glass doors that led to the country club's wraparound terrace. Grant pushed the door open, and the cold October air hit them like a physical blow. The terrace was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of wrought iron heat lamps that hadn't been turned on. Beyond the stone railing, the golf course stretched out into absolute darkness, smelling of damp earth and dying pine needles. The thumping bass of the wedding band was muffled, reduced to a dull, rhythmic ache behind the thick glass. Faye walked over to the edge of the terrace and let go of Grant. The separation was immediate and chilling. Without his body heat, the thin polyester of her dress offered zero protection against the wind. She wrapped her arms around her waist, digging her blunt fingernails into her own sides, shivering violently. The adrenaline crash hit her all at once. Her knees felt like water. She leaned heavily against the damp stone balustrade, staring out into the black abyss of the 18th hole, trying to suck air into her burning lungs. Behind her, she heard the sharp snick of a metal lighter, followed by the flare of a small orange flame. The harsh sulfuric smell of butane mixed with the scent of tobacco. "You smoke?" Faye asked, her voice rasping. "Only when I am cornered," Grant replied. He walked over and leaned against the railing next to her, keeping a careful 2 feet of distance between them. He took a drag from the cigarette, the ember illuminating the sharp, bruised angles of his face. He exhaled a long, thin stream of gray smoke into the night air. That was an impressive piece of improvisation back there. Faye closed her eyes. "I feel like I'm going to throw up my French 75. "Don't." "It was $32. Faye let out a harsh, ugly bark of laughter. She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Why is she so angry, Valerie? Did you really gut her family's company this morning?" "Yesterday morning," Grant corrected, flicking an ash over the edge of the stone railing. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark tree line. Her father drove the firm into the ground. Mismanaged pensions, embezzled funds, the whole cliché package. I bought out the board, fired him, and restructured. And the bruise? Faye pointed a trembling finger at his cheekbone. Grant touched the purple skin lightly, wincing. "Valerie's brother. He has a terrible right hook, but he caught me off guard in the parking garage. I suppose I deserved it. It doesn't make the math any less true, but it's ugly." He looked tired, not just physically exhausted, but bone-deep weary, the kind of tired Faye saw in parents who had spent weeks sleeping in vinyl hospital chairs next to incubators. The realization snapped something inside her. He wasn't a billionaire playing a game. He was a man trapped in a mess of his own making, just like she was. Faye looked down at her cheap shoes. The faux leather was peeling at the heel. "David left me because I was boring," she said quietly. The confession slipped out before she could stop it, dragged into the open by the dark and the cold. Grant turned his head, watching her through the drifting smoke. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer a platitude. He said, "I stopped being fun after Leo was born," Faye continued, her voice devoid of emotion, entirely clinical. He said all I cared about were pumping schedules and sleep training. Chloe was an intern at his firm. She's 24. She doesn't own a breast pump, and she doesn't smell like spit up. So he traded me in. And I came here tonight to prove to him that I was fine with it. To prove I wasn't the angry, bitter stereotype. She dug her hands into her hair, pulling at the roots. But I am angry. I am so unbelievably angry, I can hardly breathe. Good, Grant said. Faye dropped her hands and stared at him. Good? Yes, good. Grant dropped the cigarette onto the stone floor and crushed it out beneath the toe of his leather Oxford. He turned fully toward her. Anger is honest. Trying to smile while that mediocre man parades his midlife crisis in front of you? That's cowardice. You should be angry. He stole your time. He broke your family. Smile for your kid, Faye. But don't you ever smile for him again. The bluntness of his words hit her like a bucket of ice water. No one had ever told her she was allowed to be angry. Her friends had offered self-care tips. Her mother had told her to be the bigger person. Grant was the first person to look at her rage and validate its existence. Faye's phone vibrated violently against her hip. She flinched, pulling the cracked device from the small pocket of her dress. The screen illuminated her face in harsh white light. It was a text from Mrs. Gable. Leo woke up crying. Ear hurts again. Gave Tylenol, but he wants you. Reality came crashing down, heavy and suffocating. The illusion of being a sharp, untouchable woman at a fancy party evaporated. She was just Faye again. A tired nurse with a sick kid and a negative bank balance. I have to go, she said, her voice dropping back to its normal panicked pitch. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, instantly calculating the fastest route to the valet. My son, his ear, I need to leave. Grant pushed off the railing instantly. The exhaustion dropped from his posture, replaced by a sudden, sharp focus. I'll drive you. No, Faye said, already walking briskly toward the glass doors. You don't need to do that. You have a room full of people to intimidate. The charade is over. We did the thing. Grant caught her arm before she reached the door handle. His grip wasn't hard, but it was absolute. Faye, look at me. She stopped, her chest heaving, fighting the urge to sprint. The charade is over, Grant agreed, his dark eyes locking onto hers. But I am not going back in there. I have a car idling by the kitchen exit that I pay an exorbitant amount of money for. I am driving you home. Don't argue with me. You're shivering. You've had gin and you're panicking. Faye opened her mouth to protest, to cite her independence, to remind him they were strangers. But the sheer, exhausting relief of letting someone else take control for just 20 minutes anchored her to the floor. She swallowed hard, nodding once. Okay, fine. They bypassed the main ballroom entirely. Grant navigated them through a heavy metal fire door and into the service corridor. The muted elegance of the country club violently shifted to the aggressive buzz of fluorescent lighting and the sharp acidic reek of industrial degreaser. Waiters in sweat-stained white shirts barked orders in Spanish, dodging rolling carts of dirty dishes. Faye kept her head down, her cheap heels clicking unevenly against the wet red quarry tile. She felt like a fugitive. Grant's hand rested on the small of her back, a steady, guiding pressure that didn't falter, even when a busboy nearly clipped them with a tray of half-eaten wedding cake. They pushed through the heavy double doors leading to the loading dock. The cold air hit them sharp and sobering. A sleek, midnight black town car idled near the dumpsters, its exhaust pluming in the freezing air. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, stepped out immediately to open the rear door. He didn't blink at the sight of them, nor did he ask questions. Faye slid into the back seat. The interior was a sensory deprivation tank. The doors shut with a heavy vacuum-sealed thud, instantly killing the ambient noise of the highway and the club. The air inside smelled of pristine, conditioned leather and faintly of the cedar cologne Grant wore. Grant slid in beside her, leaving a cautious foot of empty space between them. He gave the driver Faye's address, his voice low in the hushed cabin. As the car pulled away, smoothly gliding over the speed bumps, the streetlights swept rhythmic bands of orange illumination across Grant's face. That was when Faye saw the blood. The harsh temperature shift had split the skin over his bruised cheekbone. A thin, dark line of blood pooled at the edge of the swelling, threatening to drip onto the pristine white collar of his shirt. Faye didn't think. The pediatric nurse instinct overrode the awkwardness of the situation. She snapped open her faux leather clutch, digging past a crushed granola bar and a tangled phone charger to extract a slightly crumpled tissue. "Hold still," she muttered. Grant blinked, turning his head toward her. Before he could object, Faye leaned across the leather seat and pressed the tissue firmly against his cheekbone. He went entirely rigid. The sudden proximity swallowed the space between them. Faye could feel the latent heat radiating off his jaw, the rough prickle of 5 o'clock shadow against the heel of her hand. He didn't pull away. He just watched her, his dark eyes tracking the exhausted clinical focus on her face. "You're bleeding on your $3,000 suit," she explained, keeping her voice flat to mask the sudden erratic flutter in her chest. "It's bespoke," he murmured, his voice a low rumble vibrating through her fingertips. "And I think it's technically Valerie's brother's blood from my knuckles transferring." "Gross," Faye whispered. She pulled the tissue away, inspecting the small red stain, then folded it and dabbed the cut one last time. "You need ice. Real ice, not the kind floating in a Scotch glass." "I'll add it to the itinerary." Faye retreated to her side of the car, dropping the ruined tissue into her purse. The rest of the drive was quiet. Not the tense, suffocating silence she used to endure with David when she had said the wrong thing at a dinner party, but a heavy, functional quiet. They were two people entirely depleted by the collateral damage of their own lives. The landscape outside shifted. The sprawling estates gave way to strip malls and eventually to the narrow, pothole-riddled streets of Faye's neighborhood. The town car looked absurdly out of place, idling at the curb in front of her duplex. The left headlight illuminated her overgrown lawn and the plastic tricycle abandoned on the cracked concrete walkway. Reality hit Faye like a physical blow. The adrenaline was gone. The gin was wearing off, leaving a dull throb at her temples. "I'd invite you in," Faye said, her voice raspy as she reached for the door handle. "But my house smells like boiled hot dogs and infant Tylenol. It ruins the illusion." "The illusion ended on the terrace, Faye," Grant said. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder, and opened the door. The cold air rushed in. Faye stepped out onto the uneven pavement. Her ankle wobbled in the terrible shoes. Grant stepped out behind her, standing on the curb. He didn't look at the peeling paint on her siding or the flickering porch light. He just looked at her. "Thank you," Faye said, wrapping her arms around her waist. "For the drink. For whatever that was with Helen and David. I think you saved me a therapy copay." Grant shoved his hands into his pockets. The tailored wool pulled taut across his shoulders. "You didn't need saving. You just needed an audience to watch you realize you're better than him." He pulled a thick, textured business card from his interior pocket and held it out. Faye took it. It was heavy cardstock. Just a name, Grant Hayes, and a direct cell number. If he tries to renegotiate the custody arrangement because his new wife gets bored, Grant said, his tone utterly pragmatic. Or if you just need someone to sit at table 14 and look hostile, call me. Faye looked down at the card, tracing the embossed lettering with her thumb. When she looked up, a genuine, exhausted smile finally broke across her face. It felt rusty, but it was real. Drive safe, Grant. Take care of your boy, Faye. She turned and walked up the cracked path. She didn't look back to see him get into the car, but heard the heavy engine purr as it pulled away into the dark. Faye unlocked her front door and pushed it open. The smell of Vicks VapoRub and warm milk hit her instantly. Mrs. Gable was asleep in the recliner, the television muttering a late-night infomercial. Down the hall, a soft, whiny cough echoed from Leo's bedroom. Faye kicked the clearance rack pumps off her feet, leaving them abandoned by the doormat. She reached around to her back, gripping the cheap zipper of the navy dress and yanked it down. The restrictive polyester fell open. She breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the chaotic, unglamorous, beautiful air of her own life. She walked down the narrow hallway in her bare feet. The floorboards creaked. She pushed open the door to the nursery. Leo was thrashing in his toddler bed, his cheeks flushed with a low-grade fever, clutching a battered stuffed dog. Faye knelt beside the bed. She didn't feel like a tragic ex-wife anymore. She didn't feel small. She pressed her cool palm against her son's burning forehead, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his pulse beneath her fingers. The fairy tale was a lie sold to keep women quiet and agreeable. This, the exhaustion, the mess, the fierce, terrifying love, this was real. And as Leo leaned into her touch, letting out a long, shuddering sigh, Faye realized she had exactly what she needed. Did Faye's raw, unfiltered journey resonate with you? Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when the fairy tale shatters, forcing us to find our own strength in the messy, unglamorous reality of life. If you loved this grounded, deeply human story, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more immersive, emotional storytelling that doesn't shy away from the truth.